So as Leah said, I'm Dusty Horwitt. I'm Senior Counsel with Partnership for Policy Integrity. We're a nonprofit organization, and we use legal action, strategic communications, and research, scientific research, to promote sound energy policy. We focus on bioenergy and also on oil and natural gas drilling and hydraulic fracturing. I've worked on hydraulic fracturing and oil and gas drilling issues for about the last dozen years. I started working on this issue when it was going on out west in the mid to late 2000s, and then when drilling shifted east into the Marcellus, I began to focus on this area. I've met with public officials here in Ohio over the years from Plain Township and Canton and Liberty Township. My mom grew up in Chagrin Falls, so I have some Ohio roots. And I'm happy to help in any way I can to help the people of Ohio stand up to the oil and gas industry. I first realized how serious a risk hydraulic fracturing was when I was asked to testify before the New York City Council in 2008. New York City was very concerned at the time because there was the threat of high volume hydraulic fracturing in upstate New York, where New York City's drinking water supply is contained in reservoirs. And so a bunch of us came to the council hearing, and it was going on for several hours. People were sharing some very valuable information about fracking, when in the middle of this hearing, one of the New York City Council members voiced his concern about the fracking that might occur upstate, and he said in this thick New York accent, "The purity of New York City's drinking water is absolutely critical to the great taste of our bagels and pizza." And I laughed, and I looked around the hearing room. No one was laughing. This was very, very serious for New York City. And of course, not just for the bagels and pizza. The state of New York later estimated that if New York City's water supply were contaminated by fracking, it would cost at least $8 billion to build a water filtration plant, with $200 million per year in operating costs. And that was one of the major reasons, as Kathy told us, that New York State decided to ban high-volume fracking in 2014. All along throughout this debate on fracking, which basically I think hit the national consciousness around 2008, probably the major concern, whether justified or not, has been over the chemicals injected underground in the process. And there's certainly other risks, and we've talked about them today, that are as significant, but this is one of the significant risks. What we discovered is that while we've all been studying fracking and talking about it, the EPA, the US EPA, has been very quietly assessing and regulating fracking chemicals and drilling chemicals for health risks, ecological risks, and regulating these chemicals. This has been going on for some 30 years. So we submitted a Freedom of Information request in March of 2014, and we asked EPA to give us their health assessments and regulatory determinations on fracking and drilling chemicals. They conduct these reviews under the Toxic Substances Control Act, which was passed by Congress in 1976. In theory, the act is supposed to protect us from and protect the environment from chemical risks. In practice, it hasn't always worked out so well. And we have great concern over EPA's regulation of fracking and drilling chemicals under this law. So we filed the request in March of 2014. The documents trickled in over the next 2 years. It took a long time for us to receive these documents because EPA had to redact confidential information, and I'll discuss this later. But we did finally obtain the documents, and I'll walk through a few of them today so you can see what we saw. In addition to these documents, we separately obtained from EPA the company's original submissions that detail what their chemicals are, to the extent that we could see that, to the extent that these chemical names were not confidential, and these documents also disclose some other information about the chemicals. It amounted to hundreds of pages of documents. And we received in total documents on 105 chemicals from September 2000, reviewed by EPA between September 2009 and March of 2014. what we found was first that EPA had a lot of health concerns about these chemicals. In 88 of 105 chemicals, 488 of 105 chemicals, EPA scientists had some kind of health concern, ranging from irritation to skin, eyes, mucous membranes, and lungs. And these concerns are, of course, very familiar to Raina and Jill and people in Southwest Pennsylvania and others who live near oil and gas drilling and fracking sites. And these concerns ranged to developmental toxicity, neurotoxicity, kidney toxicity, liver toxicity. They applied to 88 of the 105 chemicals. Despite that, EPA allowed most of these chemicals to go into commercial manufacture and use. There were only about 5 to 7 chemicals that were not approved for commercial manufacture by EPA. And in only a handful of cases did EPA receive health testing data from the chemical companies or request health testing data from the chemical companies. In 12 cases, the chemical companies said they provided health testing data, and in most of those cases, those testing data were not available in the public record. And then in only 5 cases did EPA ask for health testing data. So you might wonder, well, how is EPA assessing these chemicals? Well, the way the law is constructed, TSCA as it's called, the Toxic Substance Control Act, requires chemical companies to provide only a little bit of information about their chemicals. They have to provide things like the chemical's name, the chemical abstract services number, which is a unique identifier for chemicals. They have to provide the chemical structure to EPA, but they don't have to provide any testing data of any kind. EPA has the power to ask for that data, but over the years, the agency has rarely used it. And they've used it so rarely that the Government Accountability Office, which is Congress's investigative arm, in 2009 and through last year, put EPA's chemical review program on a government watch list for federal government programs at highest risk of waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement, largely because of the lack of health testing. So EPA has lots of health concerns about the chemicals. There's hardly any health testing. They allowed most of them to be manufactured commercially, and then we found that many of them were in fact manufactured and used commercially. Companies submit chemicals to EPA under about 3 different categories. One, for chemicals expected to be used in higher volumes, it's called a pre-manufacturing notice. And when we found that of the 70 chemicals submitted as pre-manufacturing notices, EPA later got a notice that 37 of those, about half, had gone into commercial production and conceivably use. Then companies can also submit chemicals under what's called a low volume exemption for chemicals used or manufactured at 10,000 kilograms or less per year. There were 33 of those chemicals, and we know that at least some of them were used. And we know that they were used because we took a representative sample of 9 chemicals, and we supplied those to researchers at Harvard, Kate Konchnik and Archana Diallo, who have spent years looking at Frack Focus, which is the drilling industry's major source of disclosure information regarding the chemicals that they use in hydraulic fracturing. And we asked Archana and Kate to see if they could find where these chemicals were being used in Frack Focus. We did the same thing with a researcher at the Environmental Working Group, where I used to work, and she looked at California's disclosure database, which has been up and running only for about a year and a half, and it shows the chemicals used in fracking and well stimulation in California. And they were able to find where 5 of the 9 chemicals were used. They identified 66 wells in 5 different states: California, Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas, where these chemicals were used. They did not find that the chemicals were used in Ohio, but that doesn't mean that the chemicals were not used in Ohio. And I'll get into this and explain why that might be. It's largely because of confidentiality. But before I get to that, you might wonder why it is that EPA is letting these chemicals out into the world when they have health concerns about the chemicals and without any health testing. We wondered that too. We asked EPA in writing, and EPA declined to answer our questions. But one of the reasons that EPA might take this action is because of the exposure assumptions that the agency uses. The EPA generally assumes when it's assessing these chemicals that the chemicals never leak, never spill, never migrate underground, and never become airborne. And we just heard from Julie about how even in Ohio alone, that's not true. And we assembled a huge amount of data, largely drawing on the compendium that Kathy spoke about, showing that EPA's assumption is just, it's preposterous. EPA says they also do consider what the companies have to say about how people might be exposed to their chemicals, but what we found is that the companies often declare that information to be confidential. Out of 70 high-volume chemicals that companies submitted to EPA for review, in 55 of those cases, the company said how people might be exposed to the chemical is confidential, so we couldn't see it. And then of all the 105 chemicals, there were only 2 chemicals in which the company acknowledged that there might be an accidental release. And in those 2 cases, the company said that a small amount of a breakdown product of the chemical would migrate underground. That was it. 2 cases out of 105 was there some acknowledgement there might be some kind of accidental release. Otherwise, EPA, unless the company says otherwise, it seems like EPA assumes that the chemical could be released, but it's going to be very controlled and purposeful. The company's going to take the waste, they'll put it in an injection well, and then it won't leak or spill when they're putting it in an injection well or taking it to a wastewater treatment plant. It's all very controlled. That's the assumption. And so if that's your assumption, and you're assuming that there's very little exposure, then it may not matter if you think there are health effects associated with the chemical, because you'll assume that people won't be exposed. As I mentioned, there's a lot of confidentiality here, and we'll see this in these documents in just a moment. Under the Toxic Substances Control Act, the companies are allowed to declare confidential basically any information that they submit. They can even say that their own company name is confidential, and in that case, EPA can see it, but the public cannot. We found that for at least 59 of the 70 high-volume chemicals assessed by EPA, the companies asserted confidentiality claims for the name of the chemical. For 52 out of 70, they claimed confidentiality for the chemical abstract services number. And the list goes on. They declared confidential, in many cases, the expected production volume of the chemical, the trade name of the chemical. And there are at least two major problems with that. One, it makes it very difficult to know where these chemicals are being used. Because what you want to be able to do is take this information and then go to FracFocus or go to your state disclosure database, like in California, and find out, was this chemical used in a well near me? That's very tough to do if you don't have the name of the chemical, the CAS number, the trade name of the chemical. And so not only can companies do that under the Toxic Substances Control Act, but then they can also do that under FracFocus, or they can do that under state disclosure regimes, like here in Ohio, they can declare chemicals confidential. So there could be a couple of different levels of confidentiality. The other problem which we ran into, which is really mind-boggling, is these confidentiality claims may prevent the public from seeing EPA's assessments of these chemicals at all. In some cases, the companies declared the use of the chemical to be confidential. They said, nobody can know that this particular chemical is used for hydraulic fracturing or for drilling. And what EPA told us is, in those cases, the company has to provide what's called a generic use. If they declare the specific use of the chemical, like fracking, to be off limits to the public, they, in place of that, have to say something like it's used as a drilling fluid, or something more vague than what the specific use is. What EPA told us is, if the company has declared the use to be confidential, and the generic use did not match one of the search terms that we asked EPA to search for in its records, like fracking or oil and gas drilling, then we might be prevented from seeing these records at all, because if EPA were to give us the record, they would thereby be admitting that this chemical is being used for the use that the company doesn't want us to know. And they said that there were about 80 records that fell under that umbrella from 2009 to 2014. And so we told EPA, just put those on the back burner, because EPA said we'd have to go through conceivably a months-long legal process where EPA would have to check with the company, and then they'd have to check with the Office of the General Counsel of the EPA to see if we could even see the records at all, and there would be no guarantee that we could. So we haven't seen those records yet. We also have not seen about maybe 400 or so records that EPA assessed, records for chemicals assessed before September of 2009, because EPA told us that all the records from September 2009 to the present are kept electronically, and those are easier for EPA to access. That still took us almost 2 years to get. And there are another 400 records that were created before September 2009 that apparently are kept in an Indiana Jones-style government warehouse. That's what they said, seriously. And it's going to take even longer for us to get those records. So there's something like 500 records still out there, which we will try to get and we'll make available. So we issued a report last month on our findings. It's available on our website, pfpi.net, and I can provide hard copies if you want, and answer any of your questions about it. I want to walk through a couple of the documents with you so you can see what these look like. Okay, so this was a document, a chemical submitted, and no one has ever seen these records before, so this is one of the international debuts of these records. This was submitted to EPA in 2012, and you'll see on the first substantive page here, there are these categories, and I'm putting the cursor right here. This says health effects data, and you can see that box is not checked. So the company is not submitting any health effects data with this chemical. The document number P120072. So the P, as in Peter, stands for pre-manufacture notice. And this is what a company would submit to EPA if the chemical is going to be made in higher volumes. If you saw the letter L, that would stand for low volume exemption notice, and that would be 10,000 kilograms a year or less. So this is generally going to be 10,000 kilograms a year or more, up to millions of kilograms of the chemical manufactured per year. Okay, so this chemical, you see there's no health testing data submitted with it. And then you can see here the company name is disclosed. This is Corsi Tech is the name of the company. They were based in Texas. They're now owned by a Minneapolis company called Ecolab, which I think is the largest maker of drilling and fracking chemicals in North America, or at least it was as of a year or two ago. On the next page here, this is where companies could disclose the name of the chemical. You can see here, this category here says chemical name, and you can see there are 3 X's here. There's nothing, and over here, this box is checked right here, and this category says CBI, that stands for confidential business information. And so they've said the chemical name is confidential, and then underneath here, you have the Chemical Abstract Services Registry number, and you can see there are 3 X's there. That's confidential too, as is the molecular formula. Then I'll show you a couple more pages here, and then we'll see what EPA said about this in EPA's own regulatory determination and health assessment. Here on this page, you can see the trade name is disclosed here. It's ClaySafe EF. And we were able to find this chemical. Our friends at Harvard were able to find this chemical in Frac Focus because of this trade name being disclosed. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't know where this was injected. And we found that it was injected in wells in Colorado, Kansas, and Texas. And then other pages show that the production volume is confidential. Like here, you see this says expected production volume, and you can see 3 X's right there. And then this is the maximum 12-month production. That's also confidential. I'm sorry, this is the first year. Over on the left-hand side is the first year production, and then what they think is going to be the maximum production in any year. Those are both confidential. Down here, this is the category of use. This would be the use of the chemical. Is it used for drilling, fracking? That's confidential. You can see the 3 X's here. And then under that, they have to list a generic use. You can see down here, it's called clay and shale formation stabilizer in well stimulation and drilling mud formulations. So the indication here and then later in the document, the indication is that this chemical is used for both drilling and fracking. And the reason that the drilling use is so significant in our view is that when companies drill, in that very first leg of drilling, they're going right down through the aquifer before they put any steel casing or cement in the well. And so if they're using one of these chemicals, odds are they're going to go right through the aquifer with that chemical, and there's going to be a high likelihood of contamination if they're doing that. So let's see now what EPA said about this chemical. Whoops. Here we go. Sorry. See the redactions already, huh? Okay, so this is EPA's health assessment and regulatory determination for the chemical. You can see there's a lot of information redacted right off the bat here, and we're going to scroll down to where they have the health summary. Here we go. So this is health summary, and it says concern based on the analog are developmental toxicity, kidney toxicity, blood toxicity, and liver toxicity. And what they mean by the analog is they're looking at an analogous chemical, because so many of these chemicals come in without health effects testing data. EPA doesn't ask for it, and so how then do they determine what the health effects are likely to be? Well, what they generally do is they say, well, this chemical that came in to us under the new chemicals review program, and these are all new chemicals that EPA is reviewing. This chemical has a particular chemical structure, and this chemical we reviewed in previous years has a similar chemical structure. And this chemical has health testing data associated with it, so we think that this new chemical is going to have the same or similar health effects as this other chemical. That could work. We did speak to a toxicologist, though, who said that there are problems with this methodology, one of which he said would occur if you were looking at benzene as if benzene were submitted as a new chemical, and it's not, it's an existing chemical, but if it were submitted as a new chemical, you'd see it would have a particular chemical structure. If you had previously looked at toluene, it has a very similar chemical structure. And you might conclude, the toxicologist said, that therefore benzene has similar health effects to toluene. However, that would not be true because benzene is a known human carcinogen, whereas toluene is not, and benzene is much, much more toxic than toluene. So there can be problems with this method. But in any event, for this particular chemical, EPA had significant health concerns: developmental toxicity, kidney toxicity, blood toxicity, and liver toxicity. And then, if you scroll down toward the end of this document, this is where they regulate it, called the focus decision and rationale. And the first line says, P120072 will be dropped from further review. That means the review process ends and EPA is allowing this chemical to be manufactured commercially. And then at the very last sentence says, due to negligible inhalation, no human health exposure-based testing was desired. So they're not even going to ask for health testing. And as I said, that's typical of EPA. And the other regulations that EPA typically typically implemented were things like they required workers to wear certain protective gear, or sometimes masks to prevent inhalation. Sometimes they asked the companies to keep the level of the chemical in water near where the chemical was being used below a certain level. But they made it clear from the regulations that companies could estimate that level. They didn't have to actually go and test in the water. And EPA itself does not track where the chemicals are being used and does not do any of its own water testing. So the regulations are fairly weak from our perspective. They're very weak. Nor were there any setbacks in these regulations. EPA did not say you can't use this chemical within a certain distance from water or a home or a school. So the regulations are not very strong. Let me just show you one other chemical that we looked at. Let's look at this one. Okay, this chemical, P090205, and I'm sorry, I forgot to say what the other numbers were. So the P stands again for pre-manufacturing notice. 09 means that the chemical was submitted in fiscal year 2009, and 0205 means it was the 205th chemical considered by EPA in fiscal year 2009. So this, I'm sorry, this is EPA's, hold on, let's save that. Let's look at the company submission first. Okay, so here's the company submission. Here, surprisingly, where it says health effects data, the box is checked. Right there. It says, yes, they did submit health effects data. And you might be interested to see what they submitted. We'll get to that. So let's see, on page 3, here's the company name. You see there is no company name. We don't know who, there's no name of an authorized official, no company, no mailing address. It's all confidential. And this was typical. Oftentimes the company names were confidential. Here, the next page, again, gets into the chemical name. You'll see that's here, there's an X under confidential. There's no chemical name. There's no CAS number. The molecular formula is also confidential. They say confidential diagram removed right here. That's a diagram of the chemical structure. It's all confidential. Let me get down to the use. Oops. Here's the trade name. So here for this chemical, there is no trade name. And so for the other chemical, we were able to find out where it was used because we had the trade name. Here, there is no trade name. And we were not able to find where this chemical was used. Not in Frac Focus, not in the California database. We don't know. It could be used here in Ohio, could be used in Pennsylvania, and could be coming to Ohio in wastewater. We don't know. The generic chemical name is quaternary ammonium compound. That's pretty generic. Sometimes companies give more detailed generic names. They should, but they didn't there. Quaternary ammonium compound. And here you can see this is the expected production volume. That's confidential, whether here for the first 12 months or the maximum, both confidential. Here's the use of the chemical. The use of the chemical is confidential. And then the generic use down here, they say inhibitor for oil field applications. So almost everything here is confidential. Then you think, but the company was an upstanding corporate citizen, and they did say that they provided health testing data, right? So we come down here, and I'm sorry, one last portion of the document is on page 11. Hold on. Yeah, so this is the section that says industrial sites controlled by others. And it has here an operation description, and this might show in some way how people might be exposed to the chemical, and it says confidential information removed. And this was typical in these documents. The companies just didn't say exactly how these chemicals were going to be used. So remember how the company said they submitted health effects data. Well, here you come down to the list of attachments, and you see they're all confidential. These have all been redacted. Over here on the far right-hand column, there are X's under confidential. on down the line. And then on the final page, it says 89 pages of confidential business information removed. And we expect that that probably includes the health effects testing data. Now, under the law, this is the only piece of information under the Toxic Substances Control Act, I think one of the only pieces at least, that companies can't claim confidential. They have to release this, but they claim it confidential anyway. And so that basically puts the burden on us to go to EPA and say, hey, EPA, you've got to make this public. So EPA would have to make the health effects data public, but we have to ask for it, and we'd have to probably go through the FOIA process, which we could do, but it adds a lot of time and effort that we shouldn't have to take. So overall, we found EPA had health testing concerns for most of the chemicals, most of the 105 chemicals they reviewed, about over 80%. They had some kind of health concern, consistent with many of the health effects that people have reported near drilling sites. We found that the companies rarely submit health testing data. EPA rarely asks for it, and yet the agency approved almost all of these chemicals for use. Some of them actually have gone into use, at least half of the higher volume chemicals and at least some of the lower volume chemicals. EPA does not track these chemicals. They don't do any testing on water for them, so that means it's up to us. And much of the information is confidential, so we can't be sure if the chemicals are being used in wells near where people are living, or whether wastewater with the chemicals is being injected in wells near where people are living and getting their drinking water. So this raises the obvious question, what can we do? Based on my 12 years of experience working on these issues, the federal government is unfortunately unlikely to help. Whether we're talking about the Toxic Substances Control Act, where we've seen the regulation is terrible, or other federal environmental laws, the industry is exempt or has important exemptions, as many of us know, under the Safe Drinking Water Act, Clean Water Act, the list goes on. Nor does the federal government step in an effective way when it does have authority. And we've seen this in Dimock, Pennsylvania, and Pavilion, Wyoming, and Parker County, Texas. The EPA did step in, there were high hopes, and then in the middle of those investigations, the EPA pulled out. The EPA was supposed to issue Safe Drinking Water Act permits when companies use diesel fuel, starting in 2005. They didn't for years. I'm not sure if they're doing that now, or if companies are still injecting diesel with impunity. So I don't have a lot of hope for the federal government. But I do have more hope when it comes to working at the local level and the state level. As Kathy told us, we made great progress in New York. That was in large part a locally driven effort. It started out with gatherings like this, repeated hundreds and thousands of times all across the state. I participated in some of those early gatherings. We've seen in Maryland passed a moratorium on fracking. The Delaware River Basin, which encompasses 4 different states, has a moratorium. Closer to home, where I live, we had our own issue a couple of years ago with the George Washington National Forest. There was interest in fracking in the George Washington National Forest, which is west of the Washington, D.C. area. It encompasses headwaters of the Potomac River, which provides drinking water for about 4 or 5 million people downstream, including Northern Virginia, D.C., and the Maryland suburbs. And we conducted a similar effort there, similar to New York, where there was a lot of local outreach. There were probably 24 local governments that voiced their opposition to drilling and fracking in the forest, both in heavily Republican areas near the forest, and then in heavily Democratic areas downstream in the D.C. area. And all of our major public water providers in the D.C. area joined that fight because we reached out to them. Fairfax Water in Fairfax County, which is the most populated county in the state of Virginia, D.C. Water, the Washington Aqueduct, which provides water for D.C. and the Virginia suburbs, both major water providers on the Maryland side, the Washington the one major provider on the Maryland side that provides water for Montgomery County and Prince George's County, the Washington Suburban Sanitary Commission, and that was key to winning on that issue. The Obama administration put most of the forest off limits to drilling and fracking. So here in Ohio, I would echo Kathy's recommendations to bring people together in your communities, organize locally, and get your local elected officials on board. I mean, I think one of the reasons that local officials can be in the vanguard in these efforts is because they don't have as many constituents. And so when they face the inevitable attacks from the oil and gas industry, they and volunteers can literally walk door to door to counter the oil and gas industry's advertising campaigns, whereas that gets harder to do when you get up to the federal level and you're talking about members of the House or Senate who represent millions of people. It's very hard for them to fight back against the industry unless we already have the political infrastructure in place. Regarding our information, we love to work with you in any way we can. One idea I had is you should ask your local officials, water providers, the Department of Natural Resources, do you know if these chemicals are coming into Ohio or are being used in Ohio? And get people on the record as saying either yes or no. I think that would be very, very valuable to make the case that Ohio needs local regulation of drilling, fracking, and waste disposal. You know, if ODNR says we don't know if these chemicals are being used in Ohio, how can people know that drilling or waste disposal can be done safely? And then if there are water providers in Ohio, I think those are very valuable allies, and also the health professionals that Kathy spoke about, I think would be very valuable allies. So we can stand up to the industry. We have done it in other places, in New York, in the DC area, in Maryland, even in Texas. People did. It's a tougher fight here than in other places, but if we can do it in other places, I'm sure that we can find a way to do it in Ohio, and we're ready to help you in any way we can. So thank you so much.